Good afternoon, everyone. It's Mrs. Wallace. I just wanted to give you a sample of the summary of evidence assignment, just so you have a little bit of an idea of what this might look like. And I'm using an example from a student I had last year by the name of Carrie Ward. And I picked her question because I think it's one that is understandable if I just give a quick description of it. And her question had to do with the development of NASA. She was very interested in the reasons that NASA was developed in 1958, and she was kind of curious whether or not NASA was really a more of like a scientific organization, or if NASA was actually developed essentially as part of a military strategy to meet some of the challenges presented by the Soviet Union, and how much NASA was kind of part of a military program. So she started her research and ultimately ended up with the following question. To what extent did the launch of Sputnik in 1957, and Sputnik is a Soviet satellite that was successfully launched into space in 1957, to what extent did the launch of Sputnik in 1957 impact the creation of NASA in 1958 as a military action? So this is not a thesis statement, this is just an HI question, but what she did with this HI question is she kind of had a hypothesis, right? She's thinking that the creation of NASA is probably connected to a military strategy that the US government had. And she's kind of testing that hypothesis throughout this HI. This is evidenced in some of the sections that she did. And just to give you a basic idea, the plan of investigation is just the description of the question and the way in which she's going to go about her research. The summary of evidence is the piece that you guys are going to be working on right now. The summary of evidence is really just from sources, a listing of different pieces of evidence that might, in this case, either suggest that NASA was very much created as part of like a military strategy, or perhaps this was something that was created as more of a scientific, kind of learning, expanding the nature of science for the U.S. government. The other parts of the HI will come later. Carrie also picked two sources to do an OPVL, an evaluation of sources. She also has an analysis section in which, in her own voice, she interpreted some of the evidence that she put in section B. So there is a time where you get to use the evidence, and you should have that in mind when you create your summary of evidence. You're looking at, later on, going through the process of using that evidence to consider one argument versus another argument, perhaps even versus a third argument. So the summary of evidence is crucial as the key information that you'll later on use in your analysis. She had a conclusion. The conclusion for the HI is largely going to be what you see as the answer to your question after considering the evidence, okay? So there's a couple things to note about Carrie's plan of investigation. We'll just kind of note it here. The first two sentences are very much historical context. On October 4th, 1957, at the height of the Cold War, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first object in space, shocking the world and ushering in a new age of space technology. In response, the United States launched several initiatives to develop the science and the defense systems, most notably with the creation of NASA. Okay, so far, what she set up is, the Soviets did this, and NASA was created. Okay, then we get to kind of what the question is. This investigation, first, it's really what this investigation will cover. This is really where her summary of evidence fits in. This investigation will cover the creation of NASA, Sputnik and other factors that went into NASA's creation, and the space program's role as a military department, okay? This sentence kind of gives a description of the categories that Carrie will use to organize her evidence in the summary of evidence. We also get a sense of her question. The purpose of this historical investigation is to analyze to what extent the formation of NASA was a military action against the growing Soviet space program. How much was this really about military strategy? This investigation will use acts and statements of Congress, blah, 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 Soviet announcement of the satellite. She has a listing of some of the things she's going to use as sources, okay? She does have her summary of evidence here, and you can kind of see it's single-spaced. It is bulleted so that different pieces of evidence are actually organized separately, but Carrie's taken from a variety of different sources evidence that speaks to leading up to Sputnik, okay? So she's suggesting that there's some pieces of evidence that maybe push toward the development of NASA, but are things outside of the development of Sputnik, okay? So in 1954, blah, 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 1957 to 1958 was declared as International Geophysical Year. This was all about development of sciences and meteorology. So she's suggesting that there was maybe a year in the United States dedicated to geophysics, and she might suggest that emphasizes the importance of science way before Sputnik. She also is suggesting that the National Science Foundation was created in 1950. The program was formed to promote the progress of science, and the Science Advisory Committee is kind of connected to this, and these may have had an impact on the decisions made after the launch of Sputnik, were essentially predecessors to NASA. So she's kind of making a connection that maybe NASA didn't come out of thin air. There were some other efforts to expand science understanding within the U.S., and these things came before 1958. And as you can see, for each of these, she's described the piece of evidence. This might be a direct quote. If it is, use quotes, or it might be paraphrased. In this case, Carrie is paraphrasing it, and she's also citing each piece of evidence. Okay, so the first piece of evidence came from one of her 8 sources. The second piece of evidence came from an additional, one of her 8 sources. You don't want to have all your pieces of evidence coming from one source, so you're trying to diversify your pieces of evidence. There's also a piece of evidence that says this emphasis on science was due to the Cold War, so she's suggesting that there's an interest in enhancing science in the United States, and we even see this with additional science programs in schools and stuff like that, because there was an interest in kind of keeping up with the Soviet Union as far as the Cold War. Okay, so this all speaks to the argument that maybe NASA is all about accelerating the sciences. Then there's some information about the launch of Sputnik. So this is kind of all about the event of the Soviet Union launching Sputnik, the Soviet Union seeing this as an important contribution. They also saw it as an opportunity to spread propaganda. Some of the way in which the Soviet Union, advertised this success and told their public about it, the way in which they use it is something that Carrie notes. And then there's another category of information, scientific response to Sputnik. So this is kind of all about the way in which there was an effort in the United States to respond to the Soviets' satellite of Sputnik, and to have kind of science that would be on par with the Soviet Union. So some of this is about the Science Advisory Committee. It would be better to have the Earth's satellite proceed separately from military development in order for all scientists to be able to look at the instrument. It had to be kept away from military secrets. So Carrie's, found some evidence that suggests that, NASA's objective was very science-oriented, not so much, about a military type of strategy. Then there's some, additional information from the act that created NASA in Congress, and she's got a quote here. And this might be important that she quoted it: "to provide for research into problems of flight within and outside the Earth's atmosphere and for other purposes, to the expansion of human knowledge of phenomena in atmosphere and space." So at least on paper, it looks like, the entire goal of NASA is all about, trying to make better science, right? It's all about increases in science. And, this is something about the National Science Board, highlighting Sputnik, and America should strengthen their scientific position. So far, everything in the summary of evidence is kind of leaning toward the argument that NASA was created essentially to enhance America's science. And, she's used a variety of different sources: an Eisenhower memo, the actual act that created NASA, things from the National Archives and the National Science Board. So there's a variety of some very, very good evidence that could support that particular argument. Then this is where we see the flip, okay? And there's nothing in here that suggests that, but we know that this is kind of a counter to the earlier arguments, the military response to Sputnik. So perhaps is there any evidence that NASA is involved in the military kind of response to what was happening in the Soviet Union? So we have this piece of evidence also from the Eisenhower Sputnik conference memo that acknowledges President Eisenhower's wishes to shift the focus of the satellite development to reflect a more militaristic approach, and that we see that there's a development of a Navy program called the Redstone program. So perhaps this isn't related exactly to NASA's creation, but simultaneously there's another program that's created with a military response. And then also we get some evidence from the NASA that perhaps within the act that creates it, there is going to be cooperation between NASA and the Department of Defense, and that actually the Secretary of Defense is the third in command on the NASA Council. So, there's some military decision-making power in NASA. What does that mean? The committee was also, entirely comprised of a few NASA officers, but lots of people in the committee for the founding document, was made up of people from the Department of Defense. So I think you get the idea that like all of these pieces of information are related to the idea that maybe it's military. And some of the background context might be important or whatnot. The key thing is there's nothing in the summary of evidence that's Carrie's voice. She's not interpreting this evidence yet. She's not weighing in on whether or not she thinks it's military or she thinks it's all about science. It might be that it's both of these things. It might be that one or the other is the stronger argument. That will become part of the section where she actually analyzes. When she gets later on to her analysis section, the only evidence she can analyze is evidence that's presented in the summary of evidence. So it's kind of a limited cheat sheet in a sense, a brief of all of the evidence that you would use to actually look at multiple answers to your question, okay? In terms of the citations, Carrie's got her citations kind of articulated really well. She's got the title of the document, and she's also got the author, in some cases, possibly also a page number, and she's got parentheticals at the end of every single bulleted point, okay? You do not need to go further than this. You're just doing the summary of evidence. You are also encouraged to go back to your plan of investigation, tweak it, organize it, make sure that the question you're posing in your plan of investigation is actually connected to your summary of evidence. There has to be some very significant alignment happening between those sections. You're not yet doing the evaluation of sources, but this would be your OPVL. You might start thinking about which two sources you are going to do in OPVL, and you're not doing the analysis section. Okay, this is where Carrie is talking about, well, one possible explanation for NASA's foundation is that it was created solely for scientific purposes. And she talks about some of that evidence, where she actually weighs in on the evidence, where there's limitations or where there's bias and where there's a great deal of things that perhaps are said on paper, but other things don't kind of correspond. On the other hand, one can argue NASA was created solely for military purposes. So in the same analysis, she'll be considering the other argument. It's not until the very end of the paper, the conclusion, where in this case, Carrie is going to say, both arguments have good supporting evidence. It was more likely that NASA was created for military purposes when considering the evidence in the context of the Cold War. And boom, that's kind of where her analysis would fit. If you look at her bibliography, you can kind of see the bibliography. This needs to be put in alphabetical order just alphabetical order. But she's got her bibliography with her 8 sources. For your assignment that's due in 2 weeks, include your question and plan of investigation, your summary of evidence, which is the new piece, and your bibliography. You are welcome to make changes to your plan of investigation and to your bibliography. So if there's a source that you don't take any information from, you might replace that source with something else. If you have weak sources that don't really answer your question and are just background information or have something to do with your topic, take those sources out. You want sources that are really going to help you answer your question and will give you kind of definitive things to use, and that's kind of key, okay? I hope this was helpful, and have a good rest of the weekend.